Every flower you see is more than just something beautiful. Hidden inside the flower is an extraordinary reproductive system capable of producing an entirely new generation of plants. But how does this happen? How can a flower produce the structures needed to create a new plant? To understand this fascinating process, we need to explore sexual reproduction in flowering plants. How does a flower actually create a new plant? Where are the male and female reproductive cells found? How does pollen reach the ovule? And what exactly happens after fertilization? The journey begins with a flower. The flower produces pollen, pollen ultimately reaches the ovule, fertilization occurs, and a zygote is formed. The zygote develops into an embryo, which eventually contributes to the formation of a seed. Under suitable conditions, that seed can germinate and develop into a new plant. Sexual reproduction involves the formation and fusion of male and female gametes. When the male gamete fuses with the female gamete, a zygote is formed. The zygote develops into an embryo, and eventually a new plant develops. An important feature of sexual reproduction is that it involves genetic contributions from two gametes. This contributes to genetic variation among offspring, making sexual reproduction an important source of variation in populations. In flowering plants, this entire process begins with specialized reproductive structures present within the flower. The flower is the reproductive structure of flowering plants, also called angiosperms. A typical flower contains several important parts. The sepals protect the flower during its bud stage. The petals are often colorful and may help attract pollinators. The stamen is the male reproductive part of the flower. And the pistil, or carpel, is the female reproductive part. Together, these structures play important roles in the reproductive process of flowering plants. Let's look at the four major parts of a typical flower. First, the sepal. Sepals protect the flower when it is still in the bud stage. Second, the petal. Petals are often colorful and can help attract pollinators. Third, the stamen. The stamen is the male reproductive part and produces pollen grains. And fourth, the carpel, or pistil. This is the female reproductive part and contains the ovules. So remember. Sepals protect. Petals attract. Stamens produce pollen. And the carpel contains the ovules. These structures work together to make sexual reproduction possible in flowering plants. Now let's examine the male reproductive part of the flower, the stamen. A typical stamen consists of two main parts, the filament and the anther. The filament is the slender stalk that supports the anther. The anther is the structure where pollen grains develop. When the pollen grains mature, they are eventually released from the anther. These pollen grains are extremely important because they are associated with the male reproductive process of the flowering plant. Now let's travel inside the anther. The anther contains specialized structures called pollen sacs, also known as microsporangia. Inside these pollen sacs, the process of pollen development takes place. The process begins with specialized cells called microspore mother cells. These cells undergo meiosis and produce microspores. The microspores then develop into pollen grains, which represent the male gametophytic stage. So the simplified sequence is microspore mother cell, then microspores, and finally mature pollen grains. These pollen grains will later participate in the reproductive process. Now let's move to the female reproductive part, the pistil, also called the carpel. A typical pistil consists of three main parts: the stigma, the style, and the ovary. The stigma is the receptive surface where pollen grains can land during pollination. The style connects the stigma with the ovary and provides a pathway through which the pollen tube can grow. At the base is the ovary. The ovary contains one or more ovules. Inside the ovules, the female gametophytic structure develops. So remember. Stigma receives pollen. Style provides the pathway. Ovary contains ovules. Let's now look inside the ovary. An ovary may contain one or more ovules. The ovules are attached to a tissue called the placenta. Each ovule contains structures that are essential for the formation of the female gametophyte and for the events that follow during fertilization. So, when we move from the flower into the ovary, we eventually reach the ovule, the structure where the female reproductive process is organized. Understanding the ovule will be especially important when we study female gametophyte development. Now let's put the entire journey together. It begins with pollen formation inside the anther. Next comes pollination, when pollen is transferred to the stigma of a flower. After compatible pollen lands on the stigma, the pollen grain can germinate and produce a pollen tube. The pollen tube grows through the style towards the ovule. The male gametes are eventually delivered to the embryo sac, where fertilization takes place. The fusion of the male and female gametes produces a zygote. The zygote develops into an embryo. As development continues, the seed forms. The ovary develops into the fruit. And when the mature seed receives suitable conditions, it can germinate and eventually produce a new plant. So the journey is pollen formation, pollination, pollen tube growth, ovule fertilization, zygote, embryo, seed formation, fruit formation, new plant. Before we move ahead, let's quickly revise the 5 important points from this lesson. Number 1, the stamen is the male reproductive structure of a flower. Number 2, the anther produces pollen grains. Number 3, the pistil, or carpel, is the female reproductive structure. Number 4, the ovary contains ovules. And number 5, fertilization involves the fusion of male and female gametes, resulting in the formation of a zygote. Remember these 5 points because they form the foundation for everything we will study next. But we have only just begun. We now know that pollen grains are produced inside the anther. But what exactly is a pollen grain? What does it look like under a microscope? How is it structured? And most importantly, how does a tiny pollen grain develop from a microspore mother cell? To answer these questions, our next journey will take us deep inside the anther. In the next video, pollen grain, structure and development.